there are liniments that have lidocaine in them. And I think people need to be aware that, certain types of liniments that might contain lidocaine or other types of medications that will test. So it'd certainly be one of the cases that I would warn people about, is make sure that even liniments and things like that don't have substances that can test.
Bring them in on the rail at a jog, please. On the rail at a jog.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of On the Rail podcast. We are tremendously excited to do this one for you guys today. This is going to be our roundtable episode for this month. And in my opinion, we've gotten three experts put together for this panel, and really looking forward to bringing this to you. The topic of today's roundtable is just kind of going to be the usage or appropriate usage of drugs and medications in our show horse world, things we need to look out for, and different things like that. So we have three gentlemen joining us today. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and let each one of them introduce themselves. So we'll start with Billy, and you can go first.
So thank you for letting us participate. I'm Billy Smith. I'm the Executive Director of the American Paint Horse Association.
And Ward, you want to go next?
Well, thanks. Looking forward to the podcast today. My name's Ward Stutz. I'm the Director of Breed Integrity for the American Quarter Horse Association.
I'm Stephen Schumacher. I'm with the United States Equestrian Federation. I'm the Chief Veterinary Officer. I'm a veterinarian, been with the Federation for my 17th year, but I started out being a pea catcher way back when, and then testing veterinarian, and then my current role. And I also have finished a PhD, and the emphasis was pharmacology.
Very good. So we're pleased to bring you guys two of the association side experts, and then an expert from the veterinary and pharmacology side. So we hope this will be a very good, comprehensive conversation for everybody today. So I'll propose this question, and whoever wants to dive in first, please, take the initiative, and then we'll just go from there. But what are some of the most important considerations for equine drug medication usage rules, and why are they necessary for the welfare of horses and integrity of the competition?
I can tell you from our point of view, there's really basically two arguments for having drug rules. And one is the welfare of the animal, and the other is the playing field, or leveling the playing field. It's, I think we're stewards of these animals, and that as stewards, we need to take care of them. And we need to recognize that sometimes not everyone, or at least many people, live by the idea of the ends justify the means. And while I think most people are honest players, not everyone's an honest player. So those are the two primary reasons we're involved, or we have any kind of rules governing medications.
Yeah, I'd agree with Billy with regard to that. When you consider our drug testing, we started that back in 1973 at AQHA. And we, again, want to make sure that there's no illicit drug use. We don't think it's important that we keep the cheaters out of our industry. And then, like Billy said, the animal welfare. I mean, certainly our horses, if we have issues with our horses, it's certainly not fair to them. It's not humane to them to allow them to compete when they're not 100%. So again, the welfare of the horse is paramount to AQHA. And so that's, one of the major reasons that it's important to AQHA.
I echo the other two, Billy and Ward. It's interesting, we have a unique responsibility to protect the horse. The horse doesn't get the say-so in what they potentially may be administered. And it's very different from what human athlete regulation. People always say, this is allowed in people. Why can't you allow it in horses? And the reason is the horse doesn't get a chance to make that decision. If a human athlete wants to make that decision, then they can do so. Non-steroidal medications are a great example of that, where we try to tightly regulate the amount that may be present in the horse at the time of competition. In human sports, WADA, World Anti-Doping Agency, they don't regulate non-steroidals whatsoever. So I think we do have our ultimate responsibility is to the horse, and obviously, as Billy mentioned, pointing out the balance of competition and the fairness of play. But really, it comes down to try and prevent horses from competing when they may not be fit to compete.
How does AQHA, APHA, and USEF approach drug testing procedures, and what are some of the challenges involved with enforcing medication rules in general?
With regard to AQHA, I mean, the testing procedures really are the way we handle that is that our collections procedures are we have contracted with the United States Equestrian Federation to do our collection of our samples, and then with the University of Kentucky to do the testing of our samples. So that's how AQHA handles our drug testing procedures. As far as challenges go, I think the main challenge is that we'd like to have the opportunity to test more horses more often.
Always a money thing, isn't it?
Kind of a similar thing with us. We're, in terms of number of sanctioned events, we're the smallest of the three represented here. And so we're kind of limited on what we can do and the breadth of it. But we do the events that we own, and from time to time, others as well. We don't contract with anyone to do the collections, but we always use a licensed veterinarian to do the collections, whether it's by urine or blood. And then ours are tested at the animal health laboratory at Texas A&M University. And we work fairly closely with them. If we think that there may be certain kinds of unique kinds of drugs that we may hear about, we'll always check with them to see if we have the capacity to ensure that that's included in our testing mechanism. I think that one of the other things that's common in organizations our size and smaller is we don't have a technical staff that that can review these policies and things like that. So we have to rely on other experts. And with regard to our conditionally permitted substances, we rely on the Association of Racing Commissioners International, because they have the technical expertise to identify conditionally permitted substances. So it's a little bit different approach, but we do our best to look to the experts to help us make those policies as valuable and as therapeutically valuable as we can.
If there was an issue with a test in your association, who is ultimately then responsible or could face, I don't know if punishment is the right word, but disciplinary process or some type of process for that?
Under USEF rules, the trainer is the one that is held accountable or held responsible, is a person responsible. Usually that individual has care, custody, and control of the horse. However, we can also identify additional people that may have been a part of that process, or may have been identified as individuals who administered the substance. And that includes support personnel, the owner, additional trainers. In some cases, we also have a designation where people can sign as coach. So let's say there's an individual where they keep their horse at home, they care, they feed, they manage the horse's health and well-being at home, but they show up at a competition and they enlist the aid of a trainer who really serves as the coach. They don't stable the horse with that trainer. They don't have grooms that take care of that horse. That's all done by the owner. Then that individual that's assisting them or giving them points on how to ride that horse or how to compete in the ring, they can actually label themselves or sign off on the entry blank as a coach. And so it does kind of limit their responsibility unless it's been identified or documented that they were involved in the recommendation of a medication or some sort of treatment. But typically it's going to be the trainer. In the FEI world, the Federation Equestrian Internationale, which is the international governing body for equestrian sports, it's actually the rider who's the person responsible. They don't have a different designation for trainer, but they do have additional support personnel that they could pull in if it's warranted.
Jenna, in ours, it's the trainer the rider or exhibitor, and the owner. It's all three. Now, it could include others if there's evidence that suggests others may have been involved in administering a substance, but it's all three, and then maybe others. They do have the ability, though, to go through in our disciplinary process, and there may be one of them that can make a case arguing they really had no contact with the animal on the day of that show, and if our disciplinary committee believes them, or if they have sufficient evidence, then they might not be found in violation. But as a matter of course, those three are always considered the responsible parties with regard to the horse.
It's the same for AQHA. Ultimately, the responsible person is the trainer. It can be the owner or the exhibitor as well. Sometimes in our investigations, it starts out, we are writing to the trainer, and on occasion, we'll find out that it's the owner that's actually responsible for the administration of the drug. So, but to start off with, it's ultimately the trainer.
Can you guys kind of touch on when you do find an issue with the test and you go through all of it, what is the disciplinary action like? Like, does it vary based on what you find, or is it all the same throughout? How does that look for the exhibitor and owner trainer?
We sort of have three categories. We have permitted therapeutic drugs that can be in the horse's system. We have conditionally permitted substances, and then we have forbidden substances. So there's no levels that are acceptable. On the conditionally permitted substances, they have to be reported at the event. So those three different categories inform what the potential penalties are. Obviously, the more serious penalties will reside with forbidden substances. There's no particular reason why that substance should be in that horse in any amount. And so the vast majority of violations that we get tend to be permitted drugs that are not reported or conditioned. We don't get a lot of foreign substances and forbidden substances, but we do get conditionally permitted and permitted, but they all have to be reported on conditionally permitted drugs. And so what normally happens is they don't report them. But the way this works out in our governance and disciplinary structure is we have a hearing, and those folks have the opportunity to present their case, and we'll present ours to a disciplinary committee. And that disciplinary committee, in making their decision, of course, they can make their decision that the person is not in violation, but assuming they make a decision they are in violation, then they have for lack of a better word, kind of a sentencing guideline that our board of directors has approved. And it depends on whether this is their first, second, or third offense. In those offenses, the punishment can be probation and a fine up to, and it could include that they're suspended and they can't participate at all, and a fine. But virtually all of the impact has to do with a fine of some kind or the ability or the lack of ability of being able to participate in our events. They do have, after that disciplinary committee, they do have the ability to appeal, and that appeal goes to our board of directors for review, and that's a 12-member body. If they think for some reason they weren't treated fairly or something was wrong in the procedure, then they can appeal it. And that's our response to due process and giving people giving them a fair shake, and they get to tell their story. And if they think they were wronged at the disciplinary level, then they've got one more level to go.
It's very similar for ours. We had an adverse analytical finding. Initially, what's happened is we'll look for a medication report form. I think that's pretty similar to your system, Billy, with as far as the conditionally permitted substances. So we have permitted, quantitatively restricted, and prohibited substances. Some prohibited substances can be used for legitimate therapeutic use to treat ongoing injuries, illness, or emergencies. But there are that classification of drugs that have absolutely no purpose to being in a horse at any time, regardless of in competition or out of competition. Once we get that adverse analytical finding, it's reviewed just to see if we have any medication report form and if it would apply under our rules. And it's forwarded under our regulations department. That department identifies the owner trainer and send out a letter of notification, just a letter of finding, saying, hey, this is what we found in the horse's sample. Is there some explanation for this, or can you provide the scenario for administration and we can review it? Then once it's reviewed, they could be offered administrative penalty or they could be sent to a hearing, depending upon the severity of the medication that was found. We range from censures up to fines, and we have had some lengthy suspensions depending upon the medication, or as Billy pointed out too, is if they've had any prior violations that can add to someone's penalty. But I can tell you, every case is looked at very objectively and based on its own merits. Pretty proud of the way that we review these, quite frankly, because we do not want to hold people accountable who did not do something untoward, but at the same time, we have to measure that with people who may try to circumvent the rules. And I agree also, I think it was earlier comment that, most people, in our opinion, most people want to follow the rules. They really do. They want to do what's right by their horse. And there's just that small percentage, I think, in my opinion, that try to circumvent the rules. And they may sacrifice horse welfare to do it. And that's why we have the program we have.
Yeah, with AQHA, our process is very similar to USEF. Our process is very similar, but we publish our fines and penalty system in our rule book. So people have the opportunity to see if, based on if they receive an adverse finding on one of those three categories, they can go in and look at the rule book to see what kind of fine and penalty would be associated with the drug, depending on what the drug is.
And that's a good point, Ward. We actually have penalty guidelines. So for different levels of infractions, there's a range of potential penalties. It's not a strict sentencing guidelines, if you will, but it does take into account, I should say, of all the facts that we develop. And so there's a range of penalties, depending upon actually the substance within certain levels. But we have 4 primary levels, and obviously non-steroidals, methocarbamol, and dexamethasone tend to be on their lower order of penalties.
So going back to who may be at risk for the disciplinary process, it seems like APHA must have like the most strict kind of who's responsible type policy, in that it's almost automatically going to be the exhibitor, the trainer, the owner, and then other people can be brought in. Sounds like USEF is focused primarily on the trainer. AQHA is to some degree too, except for they might look at other people. And I know you did say, Stephen, that USEF will too. Billy, is there a reason, or at what point did APHA decide to go towards just automatically including all 3 individuals?
I think that our organization, we have a fair number of exhibitors, particularly at our World Championship show, that don't have trainers. We still have some of that. And so rather than have to investigate to try to figure out who's most likely to have administered whatever drug is available or that shows up on a test, we've just taken the position that it's the responsibility of all 3. Now, as I mentioned, when in a disciplinary hearing, they certainly, each of the individuals can certainly make a case for why they weren't parties to the administering of the drug, or didn't know about it, or weren't present. And they can make that argument. And if they have evidence or they have a convincing argument, the disciplinary board may in fact not administer a penalty to them and just administer it to the trainer or someone like that. But sometimes we have people who say, I'm the groom and I administered it, or here's what I did, or here's how it happened. They're very forthright. And then sometimes those people become responsible. So, our disciplinary process has enough latitude where It could be an accidental administration. And we always tell people, read the labels, read the labels of everything you're giving your horse, because you may think it's not significant or it's a little snack or something, but it may have some forbidden substances in it. And so we're always trying to help our members understand that reading the label is important. A substance, regardless of how it gets into the horse, can still, depending upon the substance, improve that horse's performance. And so all of those things can be taken into consideration, and often are. That's why we don't have rigid punishments. We have ranges. So if our disciplinary board believes there was a certain amount of innocence involved in the administration, then they might tend to administer penalty kind of on the lower end. If it's a forbidden substance and it's pretty clear cut that someone was doing it to try to get an edge in the arena, then they tend to get a more serious kind of punishment. So the responsibility rests with all three in our case, because they're responsible for what happens to that horse. And ultimately, in our view, this is about the welfare of the horse principally, and then secondarily, it's about a level playing field.
I have two quick questions before we move on from kind of the disciplinary process, but maybe from all three of your opinions, what is the rough percentage, of course, estimated of people you see that have a more medication, penalties happen on accident versus an intentional situation? And then would you all define what maybe your actual prohibited substances or conditionally permitted substances, like what kind of delineates where those may fall, without having to give you can give some specifics to specific drugs if you want, but kind of like where does that line fall on medication usage? So whoever wants to take it first, and I can remind you if you've asked too much at once.
I would say that for us, when you say intentional versus malicious, I think the issue is that people just don't read the rule book, because the rules that we have are, it really outlines specific administrative guidelines for our non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. So I think that, for the most part, people might miscalculate the time that they might administer that. With those drugs, I would just say that it's probably not malicious. It's just that they don't have the knowledge of when it needs to be administered. The other issue that we've had is we have a rule where you can't administer two non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. And a lot of people don't realize that our rule prohibits a stacking of NSAIDs. And the rule of thumb is that you need to withdraw one of those NSAIDs at least 72 hours prior to competition. So, we have a number of cases where we have had stacked NSAID. And I think it's just a situation where most of the people don't realize that that's a rule. And so it's not intentional or malicious, but, that's a rule that we have to follow. With regard to your conditionally permitted therapeutics, we do have a drugs and medication guidelines, that we put out, that we, very similar to USEF. We saw that document was very beneficial for USEF. So we put our similar document together, and we do have a list. Now, it's not comprehensive, but there is a list of conditionally permitted therapeutic medications in that document, our guideline document. So does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I have actually looked at the document that you guys have available. So I know it is available on the internet for anybody that wants to do a quick Google, and also the USEF's version kind of that same thing. So I do think that's really helpful. Stephen, you want to comment kind of on the same questions on behalf of USEF?
Yeah, I think it's hard pressed to put a percentage on it. I think it varies every year. I think I can say that most of probably our infractions are for quantitatively restricted medications. the nonsteroidals, the corticosteroid dexamethasone and methocarbamol. Those are the 9 medications that we quantitatively restrict. In other words, they can be in the horse at the time of competition, as long as they don't exceed a maximum plasma level. And those are the majority of us. We do have some violations related to the prohibited substances that we do accept medication report forms for, but are potentially not filed either on time or appropriately. But unfortunately, we also have we would have substance every year that we would consider the prohibited substances or kind of like banned. In other words, those substances that really have no therapeutic value in the horse. We do unfortunately have those every year. It's hard to say percentages because it changes, it varies. When you're selecting the population or sample of the population of horses, it can vary dramatically from year to year, even though we just don't know what the overall drug use is. And so I can't say if we've had a high rate or low rate, but I think the primary function of any program is really deterrence, is the fact that any horse at any competition has the potential to be tested. And it's not going to be, the strength of the program is not finding and holding people accountable, it's deterring people from using it. So I would have no problem if we had no violations every year, if we knew no one was violating the rules. We don't take any sort of pleasure in calling positives and holding people accountable. But, again, that's the purpose of our program.
So one thing I just want to point out, and I think if I heard you correctly, the substances that are prohibited all the time are those that have no therapeutic usage, basically, and what we're saying. And I assume that goes pretty universal through all associations and whatnot. So I think that's delineating factor to point out that if there's no reason to, maybe your veterinarian to be recommending said drug, then it shouldn't be in the horse in competition.
Yeah, and those substances can include substances that are developed to evade detection. They can be substances that are intended to calm a horse down, to alter the mentation, but it's not really to treat any sort of identified emerging disease or issue. Essentially, we look at also from the standpoint that if you withheld that drug from the horse, would the horse be negatively affected? And if is it truly necessary or not? But really, that last classification of medications are the ones that no therapeutic value in or out of competition. They would only be used to, assist the horse in competing unfairly and potentially putting it at risk. That's the biggest concern we have.
Okay. And Billy, do you want to comment on the same questions for APHA?
Right. There's some similarities, but a couple of differences. For example, our rule book lists the permitted therapeutic substances that we allow for any horse as long as they don't reach some kind of toxicity level. But we use, for conditionally permitted and forbidden substances, the Association of Racing Commissioners International standards for those medications. And one of the things I think that Ward brought up, that I think is important is if you participate in multiple organizations, you need to read the rule books, because while there are similarities, there are also some very important distinctions from organizations to organizations. But it's probably definitely the most common violation of our drug rules has to do with reporting. I think that's by a long shot, is people don't read the rule book. They don't understand what they're supposed to do. My guidance is, if you're not sure if you should report it, report it. There's no harm in reporting something you don't have to report. But if you've given it to that horse recently, I'd put it on the report form if I'm not going to spend the time to study the rule book. And that's the most common violation that we have. And then we see the conditionally permitted substances that have not been, where the horse has not been withdrawn early enough. And then we probably most rarely see the forbidden substances that are forbidden under any circumstance, but we do see them occasionally. To your question of accident versus intention, that's a really hard thing to determine unless there's some sort of visual evidence of an accident. As you can imagine, most of the people who have some kind of violation are going to say, many times they say it's an accident. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't, but that's also why we have our disciplinary process and why we have an appeal process. We want to give that person whose horse is in violation of our drug rule the best opportunity to make his or her case, and before an objective panel, and maybe even two objective panels, before we do final punishment. But that's definitely not reporting properly the administration of a drug is the most common violation that we see.
Alrighty. And maybe this is a question just for Stephen, and you kind of briefly touched on this already, but do you have any other further comments on what are some of the prohibited substances commonly used in the equine industry? I can't talk today on a Monday.
One classification of substances are the antihistamines that I think frequently they're used, they're not declared. They are a class of substance that would be permitted if they're properly reported according to our rules and documenting a 24-hour withdrawal. Unfortunately, a lot of people, again, they think that people use them and they can use them indiscriminately, so why can't they use them in their horse? And they don't necessarily intentionally violate the rule, but it's one of those things where failure to report can also lead to a violation. So, I mean, that's probably the class of medications that's most commonly, I think, detected in violation of our rules. But I mean, there's also, the supplement companies out there that produce supplements, and they're not FDA, they're not approved by any regulatory agency. They can put whatever they want into a supplement. So another concern we always have is also supplements that are administered to horses that, regardless, they have no therapeutic value potentially. They may have no research to back up their efficacy, let alone their safety in the horse. But again, they're not reviewed or regulated by any sort of governing body. But we've had pauses where there are actual medications in those supplements. And what better way to make a supplement work than to put a drug in there that works? And there's very little accountability for it. We've had some major positives for some some pretty serious medications that were not listed on the list of ingredients for a supplement. But when we purchased the product ourselves, we actually did identify those substances. So and that's always a recommendation I provide to people, is that just because a supplement label says it's holistic, natural, organic, that doesn't mean it's going to be permitted or that it's even safe for your horse.
It's just interesting because now that you say that, it makes sense. Like just some of the things that I've seen personally with people not using FDA or that sort of thing approved supplements could have an impact. So now I'm just thinking about one in particular that I was debating on using a while ago, but I'm glad I didn't. But anyway, that's interesting.
They have that problem with the human side of supplements,
right?
Too.
Absolutely. That's a huge problem in an international world for human athletes. Tremendous. Any of those bodybuilding type products, I know the USADA and also WADA have done studies over the years where they've gotten these products off the shelves. A whopping some 25+% of them actually had anabolic steroids in them that were not, denoted on the label. So, it's a concern. And essentially, I tell people that supplements are great if you have a deficiency that you've identified and you're trying to truly supplement. If you're trying to use a supplement to moderate or change the behavior of a horse, then you're using it. It's kind of buyer beware. You're using it and you're relying on your confidence of that provider to be producing a supplement that's going to be free from contamination or free from a medication that was potentially included.
Yeah, excellent point to bring up. I didn't even have any questions for supplements, I don't think specifically today, but kind of on the note of things that are very innocuous or whatnot, do they need to be reported? Where do your associations stand on this? So things like omeprazole, like GastroGuard, that type of thing, Regimate, Alternagest, stuff that may be given daily or routinely maintenance dosed for horses. Where are your thoughts on that?
Some people argue that that should not be a permitted substance, that it should not be allowed because it does affect a mare's behavior when they're in estrus. And it really is to try and attempt to keep them out of estrus. But the argument for it is also if you have a stallion that has poor behavior, you can geld that horse and you can make them potentially more amenable to what they're doing and to behave or to be around. Whereas mares, it's a difficult procedure to essentially a spay or an ovary hysterectomy or an ovaryectomy on a mare. And so that's why that's been permitted. I will tell you that what's alarming is also the use of altrenogestin geldings and stallions to modify behavior. And that's being looked at all levels at this time. Internationally, it's prohibited for geldings and stallions to receive those as progesterone supplementation for behavior modification. So I could see that in our world, at least in the USEF, that's being looked at right now. And that may be something that we restrict to use only in mares. As far as omeprazole goes, some of those things, other treatments for, GI disease or ulcerations of the GI tract, those are permitted supplements or permitted medications under USEF rules. And really the reason for that is a lot of these horses have these ulcerations because of what we make them do. What we take them from a pasture feeder to a grazer to meal feeding. We transport them. We do a lot of different things. I think they're happy to do it, but it can cause some minimal stress. And so the omeprazole is definitely a permitted substance. And in my opinion, my personal opinion, I think it's rightly so.
Is there anything else you see on a daily maintenance dosage other than like omeprazole and a Trinagis that is commonly used and accepted without, you don't have to declare it or anything? I'm trying to rack my brain if there would be anything else that.
There's some sucralfate, Apoquel, which is for itchiness in horses, usually used in dogs, permitted at an international level, FEI, USEF. It treats the reaction, but it's not going to change the mentation of a horse or prop them up when they shouldn't be competing. And that's really the litmus test. But the one concern I have has actually to do with nonsteroidals when you talk about maintenance dosing. Is unfortunately, the nonsteroidals, you or I, we're not on a daily dose of Tylenol the rest of our life. Unfortunately, sometimes when horses are given, I call it the Butte sentence or the Flunixin or Equiox, what they're doing is that they get put on a medication to treat a specific injury, lameness, fever, what have you. And unfortunately, it sometimes becomes a life sentence for that horse. And that always concerns me, is that just because you and I have a headache and we take a Tylenol doesn't mean we're going to take it the rest of our life. And same thing, if we have a muscle pain or ache, we don't end up taking ibuprofen for the rest of our days. And so I really wish the response to treatment was evaluated better by owners, trainers, and veterinarians, and use these medications when it's really medically indicated.
So transitioning subjects here, but APHA recently had a case where an owner exhibitor had to forfeit their awards at the World Show due to failing a drug test for substances that were allegedly found from feeding the horse M&Ms. We as exhibitors and owners and non-pro people would never in a million years think to be concerned about something like M&Ms. So the question for all of you, or maybe Stephen specifically, who understands the pharmacology, is there anything in like common everyday things like chocolate that can impact a drug test that we should be aware of so we don't have this happen to us? And then with Billy, if APHA, if you have any further comments on the situation you want to present, that's fine.
The case of the M&Ms, there was actually a case in racing back in the mid to late 90s. Where they had a horse test positive for caffeine. And so the trainer had claimed that I don't give caffeine. However, the horse likes its peanut M&Ms. And so at Ohio State University, Dr. Rick Sams and Tim Dyke did a study where they actually would go and purchase the peanut M&Ms from the vending machine. And every day they gave a couple horses 20 M&Ms, 20 peanut M&Ms. And after 7 days, they tested the horse. And sure enough, it tested positive for caffeine. So usually it used to be that they would detect some of the methylxanthines, and they thought it was actually from administration of the caffeine. They found that obviously chocolate has theobromine in it, and it's chemically related to caffeine. And so that can be a source of a caffeine positive. I think there is a screening limit for caffeine to try and weed out some of those ubiquitous sources of caffeine. But definitely anything that has chocolate in it or pop that has caffeine in it, I would definitely shy away from. I will say that a lot of people out there, there's a misconception that peppermints are prohibited. Peppermints are good to go and should be shared with our equine friends.
So if you need a candy for a treat, that's
There
a
you
safe
go,
one.
peppermint. They love
You
it.
heard it from the expert. Is there anything then, just quickly off the top of your head, food wise or human grade food wise, that we may feed to a horse that we should be concerned about that you can just think of?
Wouldn't feed this, but there are liniments that have lidocaine in them. And I think people need to be aware that, certain types of liniments that might contain lidocaine or other types of medications that are, that will test. So it'd certainly be one of the cases that I would warn people about, is make sure that even liniments and things like that don't have substances that can test.
And I think stuff like even Oragel even has lidocaine in it or something like a derivative of it. And I don't know what the threshold limit would be if it's completely prohibited. But yeah, it's just, and I do know there are people that will put Oragel on horses before shots and whatnot. So
yeah, just to say back to the same issue of read the labels and understand, obviously some things can be absorbed in the skin. So reading labels is important. And I urge anyone who's showing horses to make sure they read the labels. And if it's like a supplement and they don't know what's in it, then I would encourage them not to give it unless they can reach out to some laboratory and see what is actually in the supplement, so that you don't fall into that kind of thing.
Another thing would be medicated shampoos. A lot of them have that topical hydrocortisone, itch relief, that kind of thing. Those can be also a concern. So again, I agree with Billy. Read the label. If it's an over-the-counter product, read the label.
would you say that most reputable products would have COAs available to be viewed on their products if they have any type of drug in them?
Would I say? I would say most reputable companies, yes.
Keyword reputable.
Yeah,
Right.
and then another area that this really raises is the CBD craze. Cannabinoids, cannabidiol is one of the most common cannabinoids that is implicated. But, again, we really don't know as much as we should about their use in horses, their effectiveness, and any deleterious effects. But really, because there's not the research, I think a lot of it's undergoing right now, and how it potentially could aid horses, what have you. But because this was a boom before we really had that information, there's no specific dose. We don't understand how much we should give, how frequently we should give. And it's a challenge to actually, CBD is a prohibited substance under USEF rules and internationally. And people always say, well, how far out do I have to withdraw? Like, we don't know. We don't know how much you're using. We don't know how much your product has in it. And then you also run the risk of some companies may claim and put their own label it's THC free, but that may not always be accurate. We don't know. So I think anytime you're using hemp products as well, and you have to be cautious about it. I would always ask, if someone asked about a hemp product, I'd ask, have you ever had this product tested by a laboratory for the presence of any prohibited substances, CBD, cannabinoids, or THC? And you really have to, again, you're taking them at their word for how potentially safe that product might be. But CBD, I think everyone should kind of be buyer beware right now. So it's not regulated.
The CBD craze hit the pet world big time a few years back too. And I don't know with AQHA or APHA, I don't think there's any tolerance for CBD currently. Is that correct?
That's correct. Maybe someday when it's fully investigated, but right now we just don't know.
Liz, did you have any questions on wacky substances before we move
No,
on?
I was just taking note for my personal horse. No monsters, no candy, that kind of thing. But it did make me stop and pause to rethink some of the things I have in my trailer, or at least look at the labels to make sure people are staying safe with the stuff they're buying from me. So
You have a vendor trailer at shows now. So
yeah.
Interesting. What is the significance of threshold and withdrawal times, and why are they so important to consider or know the rules on for your specific association when administering medications to horses? I don't know if this is more on the pharmacology side for Stephen, but whoever wants to take it.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. I'll try and be brief, but thresholds truly are going to be substances that are considered naturally occurring. So thresholds are amino acids or hormones or things that are ubiquitous to the endogenous system of a horse or human, what have you. That's truly what a threshold is. I think it's used inaccurately when it's applied to a drug. Really, what those levels are that are applied to medications or substances are really going to be action levels or limits of detection. Limits of detection is more of a technical term. And then also you have limits of quantification. So limits of detection is how low can you actually go and have a reasonable certainty that you've detected that medication or that substance at that level. Limit of quantitation is how low can you actually quantify with current technology and methodology and analytical laboratory. And action levels are where do organizations or governing bodies determine what might be excessive, is potentially have an impact on the horse or may affect the performance of a horse. And essentially that action level, anything below that's considered a negative test. It used to be zero tolerance was you find any drug at any level and it was a positive finding, but technology has really continued to progress. And so now we detect medications probably much longer than they may be active in the horse or in a human. So we may be detecting them well beyond their effective range. And so that's why administration studies are very, very important to try and determine when the potential pharmacodynamic effect ends and set your limits accordingly for your action levels. And it's changing, but I mean, the level of what we're detecting stuff now, it's quite incredible. So, zero tolerance now applies to the fact that we won't tolerate people trying to potentially abuse horses and use these medications in an inappropriate fashion. So when you talk about withdrawal times, detection times and withdrawal times are two different things. Detection times are really when the drug in a certain administration study it ceased to be identifiable or detected in that pool of horses that you tested. A withdrawal time is an additional safety factor that instead of being, 1 in 10,000 could be outside that range. A withdrawal time moves that out to, 1 in a million, if you will, a much broader range. And so detection time may be 48 hours for a substance and your withdrawal time may be extended beyond that, 24 to 48 hours past that. So it's a very fine line. It's a very critical distinction. The FEI uses detection times and then recommends that the private veterinarians actually apply withdrawal times. So it's essentially an added safety factor.
Is there any other further comments on that question?
What he says.
Dr. Schumacher's one of the most knowledgeable people in the world on this subject. Anything I add is just going to muddy the water.
That's fair. That is fair. That's why we have him here.
Yeah.
So kind of last question I have before I'll let Liz kind of go through just like what a collection or analysis process may look like at a show or at a world show level. But how can owners and trainers ensure that they are using drugs appropriately and fairly in competition? I know this is probably like a very just like overview type question, but I assume it harkens back to probably reading labels and knowing the rules. But is there any other tips there?
I think reading labels is important. Knowing the rules of that particular association is important. And just ensuring that your veterinarian knows the rules for that association. Those are three critical things. I think if you do those three things, you're going to be in pretty good shape when it comes to any kind of potential drug infraction.
Yep, I couldn't have said it any better myself.
We actually I hate to say we call it a hotline, but we do have resources for our members to reach out and ask about substances. We do that 8:30 to 5 every day during the weekday, and we'll take calls in the evening and over the weekends. But I always encourage to put this little disclaimer in there that our staff considers those to be calls in an emergency in nature. So if you have a horse that's had an injury or illness and you're looking to see what they should use or whatever, we always tell people, you treat your horse in the best fashion for the horse's best interest. All we're there to do is to try and advise you of how to get that horse to return to competition. We will not provide medical advice or veterinary advice, but the staff here always feels better about receiving the routine calls during the business hours and not being wakened up at 1 a.m. to find out about phenylbutazone that their horse is going to be competing on in 3 weeks. That may not be met with the same sort of excitement and enthusiasm. Definitely, if people have an emergency after hours, horses colicking or something like that, and they want to know the emergency flunixin rule, we're happy to help out. But I always tell people, read the labels. I think that's a great point. But then also, if you have any questions, give us a call.
All right. So I guess moving to the actual testing part, just how do you guys select horses? And Jenna said, for example, like at a world show, what are your processes for picking the horses that are going to be tested? And then who is testing them?
We test pretty much all of the world champions. Then we do some random testing. And that's sort of our little secret, is which ones we're going to pick. But then we have a testing veterinarian, and she has a couple of technicians that are employed by her. And so she manages all of that. Almost all of in our world championship show are blood draws. And then we send those samples, and we take 2 samples. And so those samples are sent to Texas A&M. And of course, if we get a positive, then we will test the other sample to make sure that there was no mistake or no error or it just gives us another layer of certainty. I think that's a fairly common practice as well, but that's kind of how we manage it.
Yeah, for our world show, we've got the open world, the amateur world, select world. We have level 2 classes. We do have some specialty classes in there. We test all the world champions, most of the level 3 reserve world champions, and then also some random horses. We also do some random horses in our prelims as well. And all those horses, I should say, those entries are determined by a random number generator that we pull before we draw for class position. So, and then we do have some other specialty classes at the World Show that will drug test as well. We do have a drug testing veterinarian that we contract with, and he brings his own technicians with him. Again, just like Billy said, we'll draw 2 blood samples, and we try to get urine as well. There's times when we can't get urine just because of the sheer number of horses that come to the drug testing area. But if we do get urine, what we'll do is we'll split that sample. So we have 2 samples that can be tested.
So both of you do blood, and then AQHA is doing urine. What happens when you collect that and then you send it off? What does that process look like, and how long does that usually take to get your results back?
We'll send our samples off every night to the University of Kentucky for testing. Depends on their schedule too, and how many samples that they're testing for. But, we can receive results on horses that are tested early in the show before the end of the show. So, their turnaround is pretty fast, but we usually try to get the samples out the day they're collected. Would you agree with that, Stephen?
Yeah, I think that's pretty consistent. So we tend to get results within 2 weeks of submission to the laboratory. So and it used to be much longer. Now it's gotten much, much faster. So
we'll get ours back in 2, 3, 4 weeks at the most from Texas A&M lab. It's fairly quick. Certainly, as Dr. Schumacher said, much, much faster than it used to be. So it's a quick process. Our veterinarian uses the appropriate scientific, methods of shipping and things like that to keep the specimen viable. And it's a fairly sophisticated process and done pretty smartly.
That's pretty impressive. And just my last question here with the drug testing portion. Has there been, or could you guys discuss any recent developments or changes maybe in equine drug medication usage rules and their implications for the industry? I know we kind of touched on the CBD, but is there anything else that has been floating around out there?
If by floating you mean rumors, that is a constant battle. Rumors. I would suspect if there's anything of significance, you certainly hear a lot about compounding. and masking agents. But again, from where we sit, it's a long drive from a rumor to something you can prove in a disciplinary setting and in a lab testing setting. But you hear a lot of things out there.
You raise a great point, Bill, and it's something that I've neglected to comment on, but that's the use of compounded medications. Compounded methocarbamol is probably a high percentage of our quantitatively restricted violations. And compounding is not a bad tool. It's a great tool if you have a medication that's not produced and you're using it off-label for a horse appropriately, and it's not produced in a way to truly be able to administer it to a horse. However, when you compound things to save money, you're also going to run that risk that the compounding is not going to be necessarily the same concentration as to what you're used to, or potentially what's labeled on the container that you purchase. So compounding is a concern. Frequently people, methocarbamol tablets can be approved in FDA quantities or from good manufacturing facilities that may be 500 or 750 milligram tablets. And you have much more confidence in that. However, when they compound it and make it a powder where you get sprinkled on the feed, you're not always guaranteed that the concentration of every scoop is going to be identical. And so that raises an issue. I think compounding, like I said, serves a great purpose when it's used appropriately. If it's just used for cost and sometimes just ease of administration, it may be more hassle or may set people up for having some violations.
I think the medications that come to mind when it comes to compounding, I'm not sure about the status of Percend and Pergolide. Is that something that has to be compounded, or is Percend still available?
No, Percend is actually the equine formulation. What happened, I'm trying to think of how long ago this may have been. It may have been 2012, 2013, when Pergolide was taken off the market for human use. And so when people were using it in their horses, it was truly an off-label drug use. And it was consistent or appropriate under the rules for off-label drug use in the horse. However, when it became no longer approved for use in humans in the US, there was a huge outcry from the equine industry saying, hey, we need this product. This is helping horses. This is beneficial. So the FDA actually worked with the equine industry and permitted its use or the compounding of it for a period of time. However, BI, Boehringer Ingelheim, then actually came out with Percend. Percend is an equine approved product for the treatment of PPID in horses. So that is not a compounded product. And because there is an approved product for use in horses, compounding would actually technically be illegal for Pergolide.
That'll rings true in my brain. And then the second one that I commonly hear people kind of reference or talk about is some of the ulcer medications. They say they can buy it cheaply compounded versus GastroGuard or UlcerGuard, I assume it's omeprazole at that point, but that would be illegally compounded though in that regard.
I'd have to know the specific compounder and that kind of thing. But yeah, if there's an FDA approved product for use in horses, that's the one that should be used unless there's a medical necessity not to use that, quite frankly. And it's in the best interest of your horse because you know that medication or that product has undergone the Centers for Veterinary Medicine scrutiny. They've had efficacy data, but most importantly, they should have had efficacy data, but most importantly, they're going to have safety data.
Perfect. Well, as we begin to wrap up here, guys, where should people go if they have questions regarding rules or usage for drugs or medications? And what kind of are some references? You've all alluded to a few, but if we want to just highlight those as we wrap up.
Call Ward.
Yeah.
Email blast.
Yeah. Read the labels. Definitely read the rule book because there's specific administration guidelines for the non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs that are out there. The one thing that I would say, and they're based on the horse's weight, so I would try to estimate, or maybe not estimate, but try to get your horse weighed so you know what the dosage should be for those particular drugs. And then we have the drugs and medication guideline that is available out there, and we're happy to try to answer those questions and then we have the opportunity to reach out to some other resources like Dr. Schumacher if we don't know the answer to those. So, but again, make sure you know the rule book and read those ingredients lists on anything that you administer your horse.
Yes. So same for us. Make sure you've read the rule book, and we have that available on our website as well. So you can look it up electronically and even search it. It's a little more efficient sometimes, but we have everything you need to know with regard to our drug rules in our rule book. But I wouldn't hesitate at all to give us a call if you have a question. We do have people on staff who are very knowledgeable about our rule book and about the RC standards as well. Just do your homework and you should be just fine, and report those drugs that need to be reported when you're competing.
I think they've about said it all. Definitely be knowledgeable about your organization's equine drug medications rules. And I think it was mentioned earlier too, is that even though your veterinarian may say something's permitted, it doesn't hurt to always check and just to confirm those. So you can reach out to your own organization and confirm that and veterinarians are great, most of them, and me being the non-one, but they may not always be knowledgeable about the specific breed or discipline that you're competing under. And I can tell you that all organizations, in my opinion, would much rather educate than adjudicate. And so they welcome the questions, they welcome any sort of input, and they're happy to be providing answers to people so they don't get in trouble.
Add that, and Billy's brought it up a few times, is that these medication report forms, is that I know that USEF has it online now. We have a medication report form online. And again, in our rule books, there's some specific rules with regard to completing a medication report form, like when they can be submitted, and again, some very specific rules on completing a medication report form properly. So I'd encourage that you review that rule as well, and then have the opportunity to, if you want to submit it online, you can do that as well.
All righty, guys. Thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate all three of you guys for taking the time out of I know you're insanely busy schedules, travel schedules, days. I know a lot of you are traveling internationally and stuff. And so this really is appreciated. And just to be said, we did reach out to a few other organizations or associations to participate, and they maybe respectfully or didn't respectfully decline. So I think those that are willing to talk about it and just educate do help the public and the exhibitors. And so that is really appreciated. And want to reiterate thank you to Billy and APHA, Ward and AQHA, Dr. Schumacher with USEF for giving us your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, gentlemen.
All right, that'll be your class. Bring them in and line them up.